Part 4. Contradiction and Production. How in practice are superstructures created, and how do they actually work?
Some preliminary thoughts on contradiction. Terry Eagleton said,
If we need a superstructure, then it is because the base is self-divided, fissured by certain antagonisms, and the function of a superstructure, by and large, is to help manage these contradictions in the interests of the ruling class.
And Thomas Larson,
Human action is to a great extent the product of conflicts and contradictions between individuals and groups with different interests. The relationship between production and reproduction could be seen as a process operating between a certain mode of production and the different ways in which this mode of production is secured and reproduced over time. This is the base superstructure theory.
Maurice Godelier said,
For Marx, the solution to an internal contradiction of the structures of the relations of production is not created solely by the internal development of this contradiction. The greater part of the conditions of this solution is outside the contradiction and irreducible to its content.
First and foremost, what is a contradiction? For present purposes, contradictions are problems a structure only has because of the way the structure itself works. That is, the problems that prevent it from succeeding are created by its own unavoidable actions. For example, a base is contradictory when it needs something that it cannot create for itself and that it in fact actively tends to destroy. Contradiction expresses itself in many ways: unfulfilled promise, weakness, paradox, mystery, threat, failure. Hence the origins and problematic nature of most superstructures. The core function of most major superstructures is to solve the problems the base creates for itself. For example, a capitalist superstructure may exist because it is cheaper and more reliable to organize an essential requirement via a state apparatus than by paying workers enough to commodify it. Or it is too difficult to commodify a socially unavoidable function. Or it addresses an existential condition consumerism can distract from but not remove. Or it manages conflicts between capitalist entities. Capitalism is full of such contradictions. The family and public education have already been mentioned. But there are countless problems that cannot be solved solely by producing and selling commodities, which is to say, by capitalist methods. Commercial solutions have been tried for most of these problems, but they simply don't work. So how are superstructures related to their base? Being grounded in the base's own contradictions, superstructures must be irreducible to their base and cannot be explained in the same terms as their base, but must nevertheless exist for the base to work. So base and superstructure must be fundamentally different to each other precisely because of the way in which they are connected. So contradiction is the first necessary element in truly explaining base and superstructure, in particular identifying what the relevant contradiction in the base actually is, and working out how the resulting superstructure solves it. This is not merely an academic problem. Superstructures are enormous. Under capitalism, they make up a huge proportion of society as a whole. In OECD countries, state superstructures alone, such as education, welfare and justice, absorb between 35% and 55% of GDP. This scale is a direct measure of how ineffectual capitalism is at solving society's problems. Many superstructures are also unique to our period. They have grown almost continuously since the emergence of industrial capitalism. These superstructures are unprecedented in human history, and they exist specifically as a result of the creation of industrial capitalism as a distinct mode of production. Contradictions also generate resistance. The oppressive nature of most historical modes of production leads to opposition. Slave, peasant, and worker revolts, workers' organizations, rebellion, and revolution. Resistance can also lead to alternative superstructures, political movements, unions and cooperatives, collective social provision, radical ideologies and media, and radical political parties. This resistance can be very effective. Trade unions have forced many changes to capitalist employment, such as minimum wage and maximum hours, health and safety regulations, sick pay, paid holidays and weekends, parental leave, and equal pay, diversity, and anti-discrimination laws. The results can be very tangible. For example, union members in the UK are paid 10% more than non-union members, have 25% more annual leave, have more stable employment, and suffer 50% fewer accidents. But contradiction alone is not enough. Understanding how contradictions lead to the creation of superstructures may be the first necessary element of any theory of base and superstructure. However, although necessary, contradiction is not sufficient. We also need to explain exactly how superstructures actually solve the problems the base's contradictions throw up, in active, material, human terms. So what is the second necessary element for explaining base and superstructure? This second necessary element is production. Why production? If superstructures create material solutions to the base's material problems, how are they to do that? They cannot rely entirely on the forces and relations of production of the parent base. Otherwise, the base would solve its own problems. So how is it done? At the most general level, each superstructure has its own system of production. This includes both forces and relations of production. Some of these elements may be taken from the parent mode of production, most commonly the form of employment, salaried or wage labor, but never all. As superstructures arise from and serve to resolve, or at least ameliorate, contradictions in the base, they can never use absolutely the same methods or forms of production as the base. What does system of production mean? The base is a fully material entity. That is, it is full of real people doing real things with real tools, materials, and so on. Its superstructures exist because the base fails to produce all its own needs, which are also material. Therefore, solving the base's problems requires its superstructures to produce something material for the base, a product, a service, a facility perhaps, or a desire, a belief, or an expectation, but not by using methods the base already possesses. Therefore, each superstructure must have its own system of production. That is the only way a material result is possible. This must include at least some specialized and unique means of production. For example, special knowledge, skills, tools, systems, rules, standards, organization, and so on. Such a system of production must be exactly as material as the underlying mode of production, and therefore have the same effects on individual consciousness and social history, though on a reduced and narrower scale. A superstructure can make use of resources from the base and of forces and relations of production the base creates. But because superstructures need to do things we know the base cannot, superstructural systems of production likewise cannot work exactly like the base, which is to say, like the underlying mode of production. Therefore, superstructural systems of production cannot be wholly reduced to or wholly explained by the base's own mode of production. That is, superstructural systems of production can only work if they are different from their underlying mode of production. It's true that a base and its superstructures often use similar forces of production. Much takes the very same form, for example, books, computers, bureaucracy, infrastructure, offices, and so on. But these shared means of production are typically very generic and not specialized tools, skills, knowledge, or organization specific to that particular superstructure. By contrast, the superstructure's most specific means of production are not shared with the base, or usually other superstructures, classrooms, law courts, weapons, prisons, textbooks, hospitals, and so on. And some superstructures share very little with the base, such as families, religion, art, and defense. Capitalism's relations of production also don't apply. For example, schools, armies, families, courts, public hospitals are not privately owned or subject to private property rights. They cannot be bought or sold. Control is based on authority, not ownership. This authority is frequently based on public appointment. Nor do they operate commercially, that is, by buying and selling goods and services, nor do they create surplus value. No value is extracted by the ruling class, and financial success depends on meeting a budget, not delivering a profit. Of course, a superstructure's personnel are often employees, like other working people. They are typically waged or salaried. They are subject to normal forms of employee management. They have conventional contracts of employment. They are largely subject to ordinary employment law. They work in bureaucratic hierarchies of specialists, the most common form of industrial organization. Some aspects of supervision and discipline are similar. But even this is by no means identical to ordinary employment. Many are subject to special professional methods of organization and control. Employment requires mandatory formal qualification and selection. They must adhere to professional standards. Advancement is based on professional qualification. They are subject to independent discipline and professional protection. And some are not like employment at all. For example, families, congregations, and membership organizations. In summary, the differences between the underlying mode of production and a superstructure's system of production are essential for what the superstructure does for the base, yet inexplicable in terms of the base and inoperable by the methods used by the base. So can there be a society without superstructures? Just as superstructures arise because the underlying base suffers from contradictions, so a base without contradictions would cease to generate superstructures. So given that socialism, perhaps, and communism certainly would operate without contradictions, they would need no superstructures. In such conditions, there would be no need for many of the superstructures on which, say, capitalism relies. Any functions performed by superstructures under capitalism that socialism or communism still needed would be performed by the base, for example, mass education or childcare. There would be no division or conflict between the social groups that serve different, and now often opposed, parts of base and superstructure, that is, working and middle classes.